Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to the fourth Premodern Korea lecture series at the George Washington Institute for Korean Studies. This is the last in our current series, and recordings of all prior lectures can be found on the GWIX YouTube page. So my name is Jack Davey. I'm an early Koreanist and I'm an affiliate of the Institute. I'm filling in today for the director of the Institute, Dr. Jisoo Kim. I'd really like to thank everyone for participating today. And yeah, it looks like we've got a really good sized audience. So I hope we have a lively Q&A session after the talk. So it is really my great pleasure to moderate this talk today because the lecture focuses on early Korea, which I think it's fair to say is the most pre-modern of pre-modern Korean history. And this is a time span that encompasses hundreds of years, saw the appearance of many extremely important, extremely fundamental aspects of what we think of as Korea today. And at the same time, I think it's also fair to say that it's often forgotten, or at least de-emphasized compared to, let's say, the Choson period. And I'm also really excited that our speaker today is Dr. Marjorie Burge, who I would say is one of the most exciting recent scholars of this period, and she's doing research that really nobody else is. Dr. Burge received her her BA in Asian Studies and Japanese actually here at George Washington. So this is really something of a homecoming for her. But she received her MA and her PhD from the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at UC Berkeley. And since then, she's been a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago, and she is now an assistant professor in Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And her research focuses on Sinographic literary culture in early Korea and Japan, and her work really blends history, literature, linguistics, material culture studies, all kinds of stuff. It's very interesting. Much of her work focuses around the analysis of mokkan, or wooden strips with writing on them. And she's working on a book project on this topic entitled Unearthing the Written Cultures of Early Korea and Japan. Her talk today is very much related to this and is titled Inscribing the Realm, Early Sheilla Written Culture Through Mokkan. And before I give the floor to Dr. Burge, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be having a Q&A session after this talk, and that if you have a question either during the talk or afterwards, if you could use the question box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and not the chat box. So with that out of the way, Dr. Burge, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack, for the introduction. And yeah, it's great to be back at GW, of course. I'm really grateful to Professor Jisoo Kim for the invitation and for the Institute of Korean Studies at GW for hosting this today. As you were talking about, right, I do feel a sense of duty to represent early Korea studies in this series, because this is a field where there really are so few scholars who are working on this era of Korean history. And, okay, so why is that the case? Well, in my estimation, it's largely a problem stemming from the paucity of sources. I don't think it's because this era is lacking in interest anyway. But I'll get into that and why mokgan are kind of an exciting new source for people who are interested in kind of trying to learn more about this period. So I'm going too fast here. So just kind of a rough map here to start. I've only really drawn borders in here as a visual aid. I have feelings about borders in this period, but they're certainly not lines on a map usually. They usually have more to do with, who controls what fortifications and what rivers and that kind of thing. But just so you have a general idea of what we're talking about here, I'm going to start with this. I'm mainly going to be focusing on the about 100-year period between around 560 and around 660, basically after Sheilla has absorbed the so-called Kayak confederacy, which is a number of small polities located in the southern central part of the peninsula. And before Sheilla conquers its two larger peninsular neighbors, Goguryeo to the north and Paekje to the southwest, in 660 and 668. So what I'm going to be talking about today are what are known as mokgan, which a very simple definition is that they are inscribed wooden strips. And it's really these that I think are serving to reopen the Three Kingdoms period to scholarly inquiry in new and exciting ways. Because as more and more are discovered, they become new source material, which previously this era was largely only known to us through Koryo period texts like the Samguk and Samguk So mokgan, by definition, are sort of a more immediate, direct, and primary source because they were deposited in the ground sometime after, their usefulness ran out. They were thrown away and buried. And then they're recovered by modern archaeologists, and there are no editors or commentators in between shaping how we are to understand these inscriptions. That also makes things difficult in other ways as well, but there's a certain directness and immediacy there that is lacking with some of those more traditional textual sources. They're also this everyday ephemera of written life because they are unpolished fragments of mundane communication that has been conducted in scripted form. This is not only new material then for this period, it's also a new kind of material altogether because never before have we been able to probe the mundane realities of bureaucratic communication for this period in Korea. Maybe that doesn't sound exciting to everyone, but it's very exciting to me. Moreover, on an individual level, they are certainly these fragments of everyday communication. Taken as a whole, they also offer important insights into the functions of writing in early Korea. And in turn, those insights enrich our understanding of how kingdoms like Sheilla and Baekje administered their territory and worked to integrate people from far-reaching parts of the realm into a network of centralized control. So I say Sheilla and Baekje because we don't yet have mokgan from Goguryeo. There was actually, I guess I should put an asterisk next to that now, because there's actually a single mokgan now discovered from a mountain fortress located in modern Seoul. The site, which is Mongcheon Tosong, which is more well known as part of Baekje's capital fortifications when Baekje's capital was in the Han River Valley through 475 when Goguryeo comes in and conquers that area. At which point that site is then occupied by Goguryeo, right? And they make a number of repairs to the site. And the mokgan that was found in layers that are identified as being Goguryeo layers at the site. So in theory, this is a Goguryeo mokgan, which is very exciting because we've never had a Goguryeo mokgan before. Unfortunately, the inscription is pretty much totally illegible. But it is really nice to have confirmation that mokgan were indeed used in Goguryeo and that we can hopefully expect further discoveries in the future. But because so far this is all we have, my work does not yet really touch upon this subject because it's not yet really a subject for scholarly inquiry, but hopefully will be in the future. So all that said, today I'm going to focus on what Mokkan can tell us about the written culture of the Sheilla kingdom specifically. I will reference Baekje occasionally as a point of comparison. So why Sheilla? Well, first, so far, mokgan finds from Sheilla sites have been considerably more substantial than those from Baekje sites. They come from a wider range within Sheilla's territory, as I'll talk about. Second, because historical records for the Sheilla kingdom, including the Samguk are generally considered more or less reliable from about the mid-6th century, we can connect the appearance of a number of different mountain fortress sites that yield mokgan deposits to significant developments in Sheilla's territorial expansion and state centralization efforts, as we know from the Samguk. Third, the written cultures of Sheilla and Baekje, while they do share some common features, are indeed distinct. I would say that it's basically impossible to talk about a singular early Korean written culture, and why would we want to, right? So probably most illustrative of the distinction between these two, just to kind of make it clear why I'm not going to be touching on both of them today, is what we can gather when I put the two tables about mokon finds side by side here. You'll notice that Paekje's table is much bigger. But this is because we have mokgan coming from more different sites in the Paekje context, but overall numbers are smaller. It's only about a third, 93 versus 306. We have about a third of the number of mokgan from Paekje as we do from Koguryo. So we have more sites, but fewer mokgan from each site. In addition, of the 14 sites that are in this table for Paekje, only one of them is not located in Paekje's former capital of Puyo, Sabi at the time, modern Puyo and Chungcheongnam-do. And the one site that is not in Puyo is Pogam, which is in Naju. Other than that, these sites are all in the capital. And as I will be talking about, this is very different from the situation in Sheilla, where most sites, at least for pre-660, are outside of the capital. So I'm going to argue that kind of that context where Sheilla Mokkan sites are distributed kind of at great distances across its territory, as opposed to in Paekje, where they are kind of more consolidated on that capital-based written culture, that's really crucial for understanding the function of writing as a technology of integration in 6th and 7th century Sheilla. So just a quick note before I, okay, well, we'll return to that. I didn't turn to that soon enough. I apologize. But just a quick note about categories of mokgan, because I will be using these throughout my presentation today. Generally, scholars divide mokgan into 3 general content-based categories: documents, tags, and other. Documents are basically anything that appears to be some sort of formal communication, formal bureaucratic communication. Tags can be understood as shipment labels. They typically have this kind of shape. This one in the middle here is a very typical tag shape, where you've got V-shaped grooves carved into both sides on either the top or the bottom, or sometimes both. And this is because that's where a string would be tied around the mokkan to attach it to the parcel that it was labeling. So that's, if you have a mokgan that's shaped like that, it tells you, even if you can't read it, that it's probably was a tag, a shipping label. And other is a catch-all category, which includes everything else, but particularly things like writing practice mokgan and mokgan used as ritual implements and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to clarify that before I move on. So in my talk today, I'm going to first outline what we knew about early Sheilla written culture from documentary and epigraphic sources prior to the discovery of mokgan from pre-unification Sheilla. And then I'm going to discuss current mokgan finds within that larger context in order to highlight the new insights that mokgan offer to us. And specifically, then I'm going to do a deep dive into a single site, the Haman Songsan Fortress site, which, if I very quickly go back here, you will notice has by far yielded the largest number of mokgan from any single site on the Korean peninsula to date. So I'm going to look in depth at that site, basically to argue that Sheilla written culture in the century from about 560 to about 660 is a phenomenon associated with the spread of an administrative state, and that writing played an important role in how Sheilla approached integrating new and distant parts of its realm, beginning in the 6th century, but stretching into the late 7th and also the early 8th centuries as well. But allow me to begin with the state of writing in Sheilla in the mid-6th century as we know it from non-mokgan sources. So I'm going to start with 2 Chinese histories, which, although they give very brief accounts of the kingdom of Sheilla, they do kind of together tell us something interesting about the reception of sinographic writing in the 6th century in Sheilla. So in the Liangshu, which is the history of the Liang dynasty, a dynasty was located in the southern part of China in the early part of the 6th century, we are told very frankly, that Sheilla has no letters, right? They don't use writing. They instead conduct correspondence by carving wood. And this is a reference to, this reference to carving on wood is not meant to be taken literally. It's kind of a typical way you find in Chinese text to referring to societies that don't use writing and use other means to communicate. So we shouldn't take that too literally. But the important thing here is that, we're given a very clear statement that Sheilla does not use writing. And then when we get to the Sui Shu, the Sui dynasty being the dynasty that reunited China in 587 and then fell to the Tang in 618, we're suddenly told in the history of that dynasty that Sheila's letters, armor, and weapons are the same as in the Middle Kingdom. Now, compilation time-wise, these texts are actually not too far apart, but if we take them as reflections of the kingdom of Sheilla as known to archivists in the Liang versus archivists in the Sui, there does seem to be kind of an overall narrative here, right? One in which Sheilla has adopted sinographic writing fully by the end of the 6th century, such that there is no distinction from China itself, right? Whereas in the early part of the 6th century, maybe they weren't quite there yet, right? And, I think some scholars have dismissed the Liang count in particular because Liang had very limited contact with Sheilla, and they may have been relying very heavily on earlier sources. But as I'm going to point out, Samguk and epigraphic sources for the early 6th century do seem to tell a very similar story, where you're really starting to get inscriptions for the first time in the material records starting in the beginning of the 6th century and really ramping up by the middle of the 6th century. In terms of what inscriptions we know from prior to the 6th century, there are a few, but they are primarily single characters or short sequences of characters found inscribed on lacquerware vessels or metal ornaments from 5th century royal tombs in Gyeongju. And we also have, a few Chinese-produced metal artifacts with inscriptions on them as well. But that's pretty much it for anything prior to the 6th century in the Sheilla context. The earliest epigraphic texts that we have are 2 stone steles that were found in the city of Pohang, the Nangsingmi stele and the Chngsan Steelies here. And these date to the earliest part of the 6th century. And we also have some of the earliest sinographic inscriptions that are part of the Chonjani petroglyphs in Ursan, also being, that we're able to date. The earliest ones we're able to date are also from the very beginning of the 6th century. So this is a time period that in the Samguk corresponds to the reign of a ruler known as Chijung, who is depicted first and foremost in that text as a reformer looking to remake Sheilla according to Chinese models of bureaucratic governance. According to the Samguk the important reforms begun by Chijung in the first part of the 6th century were expanded and built upon by his successors Palpun and Chinhung, who I'll talk more about in just a minute. And their reigns in particular, as opposed to Chijung's, are characterized by significant territorial gains, which followed upon military victories, of course. And this is a situation in which it would have been necessary to accelerate some of those administrative reforms in order to be able to administer those new territories. And within that context, writing becomes an important tool for bringing order to the chaos, as I like to put it. So to put it very simply, then, there is a very specific reason that we can point to explain why Sheilla goes from no letters to letters in the space between the Liangshu and the Suishu. 6th century Sheilla was an ascendant military power. That's the basic reason that we can point to. This map here, again, very rough. Borders are not meant to be taken literally, just kind of guidelines. This shows the situation kind of around the turn of the 6th century in the Korean peninsula. And over the course of the 6th century, Sheilla was quite successful in capturing large swaths of territory from its rivals, Goguryeo and Baekje, of course, and in slowly extinguishing what is known as the Kayaks confederacy, the Kayaks polities, one by one, such that by 560, we end up with that map that I started off with here. You know, as any good student of Chinese bureaucratic models knows, the martial side of things, the Wu, must be bolstered by the literary or cultural Wen. In other words, Sheilla starts using letters in the 6th century precisely because of its military conquests, I would say. And, you know, in practical terms, this is because letters are an important tool to rule over those territories once you've conquered them. So the earliest epigraphic texts, which, as I noted, date to the first part of the 6th century, they primarily feature inscriptions that detail the outcome of legal disputes over land rights. And this is a phenomenon which suggests the growing importance of the existence of written law codes and the state's ability to arbitrate disputes based on those law codes, right? And that is a means of substantiating the state's authority and the state's role in the life of local people. One stele dated to 524, I believe it's this one, the Mokkan stele here, informs us of a legal decision related to the punishment of villagers who staged an uprising against Sheilla rule. And we have another that I didn't include on this slide that describes the construction of an embankment in 536. So, memorializing kind of the state's role in organizing the construction of key infrastructure for people. And kind of, as we move forward beyond this early part of the 6th century into the mid-6th century, we get more and more of these stone stele inscriptions, and these become also increasingly more monumental, with the reign of Chinhǔng in particular. So the so-called Chinhungs Steelies, which I've mapped out here, kind of the ones that we're aware of that are still extant, they're fairly widely distributed, and with the exception of the Chngsan Steelies down here, all of them are on top of mountains with impressive vistas of the surrounding area. And so I really like this photo here, which shows the original context of the stele on Mount Kangsan in modern Seoul, that this is, I think this image tells a very particular kind of story about what these steles were doing in the context of the landscapes in which they were embedded. Just to get back to this map though, 4 of the 5 steles feature inscriptions which detail the king's progress to the spot with the dates when he did so. The 5th, which is the Mount Kamak stele here, that doesn't actually have an inscription at all and doesn't seem to have ever had an inscription, which is really interesting, but it's similar in both style and material to the other 4. And it's known that it was called the King's Steelies going back some centuries. And so it's generally considered to be, just something they either forgot to inscribe or, again, took the presence on the mountain as kind of enough of, more kind of getting the message across, right, even without the inscription. So 3 out of the 4 of these also, the Mount Mokkan Steelies and these 2 on the northeast coast, those are found, to have dates on them, which correspond to 568. And they seem to have been erected as part of kind of a single royal tour that went through some of these lands that were kind of more recent territorial acquisitions, particularly here in the Han River Valley, and then stretching up the northeast coast. It's really interesting to see kind of that Sheilla had, conquered its way up the northeast coast here. We don't have much information about if there are any more Sheilla sites in this area, but certainly they probably didn't control all the way into the inland, but probably, again, just along the coast here. But these sites would all be, have been more or less Sheila's frontier at the time, the Han River Valley, and then stretching up the northeast coast there. And then the fourth inscribed stele, the Chngsan Steelies, that's dated to 561 and seems to have commemorated an inspection of land that had been captured from one of the last standing Kaya polities, Piha Kaya. In this kind of new age of inscribed authority in the 6th century, we see that the mere act of making a royal progress and ritually inspecting the land, that was insufficient. Now we have a written document being produced commemorating the event, substantiating its occurrence. That document is not just composed, but carved into a massive stone monument. And that stone is embedded into the landscape where the king once stood to kind of memorialize and perpetuate his presence in that landscape. I think the symbolics there are fairly straightforward. Again, I think that picture kind of says it all. But you have a giant stele that stands in for the figure of the king, embodies his ritual authority over the space in which it stands and all the space that extends outward beyond that space. So, that all that land that is kind of extending below as being part of the king's, within the king's realm of authority. So I've gone through all of this fairly quickly with two aims in mind. So first, I wanted to give you all a sense of what we knew of written culture in Sheilla prior to the discovery or significant discoveries of Mokkan for pre-unification Sheilla. And second, I wanted to situate the discussion of Mokkan and the production of Mokkan inscriptions in this larger historical context. So the general picture that emerges from Samguk and epigraphic sources is fairly clear, I think. But again, the sources are indeed few. Together, they tell this rudimentary story about the 6th century as this time of military ascendancy and territorial expansion that prompted increasing efforts at transforming the Sheilla state according to models of Chinese-style legal code-based bureaucracy. But as I'm now going to argue, Mokkan can shed light on how important writing was in making this transformation successful, and by helping to fill in some of the more concrete details of how writing operated as part of the process of integrating the realm. So I showed this map already, I think once or twice, but I'm going to go into some further detail now about the different sites on here. These are all sites where mokgan belonging to the century between 560 and 660 have been recovered, or approximately that century. Not all of these can be dated firmly, but more or less can fit into that window. Of these 5 sites, only one is located actually in the Sheilla capital. That's the Wolsamot site in Gyeongju. The other 4, as you can see, are all at varying remove from the capital. Let's see, 3 out of 4 of them are mountain fortifications. The one exception being Ponghangdong in Kimhae, which is seems to have been an administrative center. And 2 are found in the Han River Valley, this Kayang Fortress in Incheon and Isang Fortress in Hanam. Excuse me, I keep losing my place here. And the mokgan from Haman Songsan Fortress and Kimhae Ponghangdong have been recovered from facilities that were constructed by Sheilla on sites that were once capitals of vanquished Kaya states. So, there is obviously symbolics involved in that, right? And going in now that you've conquered and building on top of those former capitals. So in other words, these 4 sites are all located in places that were new to Sheilla control in the mid to late 6th century. And as I will be saying, I don't think that's a coincidence at all. As a point of reference, I just want to quickly compare this map to the Chinhungs Steelies map that I just showed. Chinhung traveled to and erected steles in the Han River Valley, right? Mount Kayaks Steelies and the Mount Mokkan Steelies, both being in the Han River Valley. we can imagine, in addition to doing that, him ordering the construction of fortifications like that at Kayang Fortress and Isong Fortress. Likewise, he traveled to, again, the capital of the former Piwakaya state and erected the Changhnung Steelies there, right? And simultaneously, within that same time frame, likely ordered the construction of the Songsan Fortress in Haman. That was built on top of the former Arakaya capital. And as we also have the construction of the administrative center at Kimhae Pongwangdong, which is on the site of the former capital of Kungwankaya. So there's obviously a pattern here. And I think, these maps have a lot of resonances for that reason. The inscriptions on the mokgan found from these sites, tell us that the fortifications themselves, which have long been in the Korean context markers of territorial control, changing hands of fortresses is kind of how warfare is conducted to a large extent. But these are no longer simply centers of military power, but they've come to function also as administrative centers now, beginning in the mid-6th century. And they're playing an important role in how people living in newly occupied lands came to fall under the control of the Sheilla state. So let me briefly introduce each of these sites, just in order to then move on to focus on the Haman Songsan Fortress site in detail. Both because, obviously it has yielded by far the largest cache of Sheilla Mokkan to date, but also because in many ways it is a representative case study of how writing was a part of integrative strategies at the local level. And I'll get into why I think that is the case. So Kayang Fortress in modern Incheon and Ponghwangdong in Kimhae, those are the furthest sites apart geographically that I have on this map here, but they actually share some really interesting features in common. Specifically, they're both located on the far extremes of Sheila's domain, right? So they're probably symbolically and strategically important as frontier outposts, but probably most importantly for our purposes, they've yielded both of them two strikingly similar analects mokkan. And analects mokkan refers to mokkan that have inscribed excerpts from the Analects of Confucius. And the only two known examples that we have from Sheilla are the mokkan found from the Kayang Fortress site and Kimhae Pungwangdong. And both of these, in this case, they feature faithful transcriptions actually of the same chapter, known as the Gongye-chang chapter. And this is not, again, we see Analects Mokkan in Paekje or in Japan as a point of comparison. This is not the typical part of the Analects that people are transcribing. It's actually quite removed from that. So it's really interesting to see that not only are they doing something that's kind of outside of the norm, but they're both doing it. And they're both doing it kind of, at this great distance from each other. Both of the mokgan were probably originally 1.3 meters long and were carved from pine branches, resulting in what's known as a writing rod, rather than kind of the typical flat mokgan that has two sides. These are basically wooden stakes that you can write on all four sides. Or in the case of the Kayang Fortress mokgan, it weirdly is carved so it has 5 writing surfaces. It's the only example I know of that from any sites in either Korea and Japan. So it's sort of an interesting anomaly there. But in terms of what these were used for in both cases at these sites, again, they were very distant from each other. They were probably both study aids for officials who are living and working at these sites. So these sites are so far away from each other, but they kind of weirdly are both these frontier outposts. And then we have them yielding such similar yet singular mokgan. This is a really striking thing. And I think it suggests maybe something about the life of a provincial official living and working at a site like this, that we would have such a, these two Analects mokgan that are so similar at such distance from each other. So Hanam Isong Fortress is located just outside of modern Seoul in Hanamshi in Gyeonggi province, and it's on top of a low peak, which is Mount Isong. It offers pretty extensive views of the Han River Valley. And the site is actually unusual for a number of reasons. So it was probably first built in the mid-6th century, shortly after Sheilla had seized the Han River Valley. So it seems to kind of clearly been something motivated from those strategic needs coming out of that conquest. But the site has, weirdly, actually a large number of uninscribed mokgan that were found. We actually have 25 that just have no evidence of having anything been written on them at all. We have only 12 that have discernible inscriptions. Also 12 out of those, 37 totals inscribed and uninscribed mokgan, 12 of those were found inside 3 earthenware jars that I have on here. And those jars were found at the bottom of a reservoir feature at the site. So this is, very, very strange. It's not something that we find elsewhere in terms of mokgan sites from, Sheilla, Paekje, Japan, anywhere that I'm aware of. And the site actually has also yielded 30 inkstones, which is also very peculiar. It's the largest number from a single site outside of Sheila's capital of Gyeongju, and it's highly unusual for a provincial site to even find 1 inkstone, never mind 30. So clearly something interesting was going on here. We also have 2 large-scale tiled roof buildings that have been identified here. This is in this reconstruction here. You can see that. This has led to theories that the fortress was an administrative center for a newly established province of Shinju. In any case, the unusual characteristics of the site suggest it was more than just a military fortification, right? So we're moving away from these fortresses being purely military in purpose and having more of this administrative function. The content of most of the mokgan inscriptions is difficult to assess because there are problems of legibility. The content, but we have 2 examples of document mokgan from the site that confirm the view that the fortress was probably likely home to some sort of authority that had connections to the central authority. Just to kind of cite a quick example here, we have kind of a typical document mokgan, and this is actually a writing rod mokgan as well, where a Tosa of Namsan Fortress together with someone, the text is missing, is making a report to somebody at the fortress, we assume. And this style of document of reporting is something that I'll talk more about in a few minutes with the Haman Songsan site as well. So now I'm going to jump into the Haman Songsan fortress because as I noted, it obviously stands out because of the large number of mokgan recovered there. I also love that it's a palindrome in Chinese characters, but that's just a fun point on that. Literally the name of the site is Fortress Mountain Fortress. So, it's sort of fun for that reason. The circumstances behind its construction and the unique conditions under which the mokgan have survived, though, do tell a pretty fascinating story about writing in 6th century Sheilla. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time I have kind of digging deep into this particular site. So Haman Songsan Fortress is located in modern Kayaks Hamangun in Gyeongsangnam-do. It's on a small peak that's known as Chonamsan, but also Songsan, as I mentioned, Fortress Mountain. As we've noted, it has yielded by many leaps and bounds the largest number of mokgan recovered from a single site to date on the Korean Peninsula. Totals more than 250 pieces, I think, right now that have, identifiable writing on them. The number goes higher if you include mokgan that don't have identifiable writing on them. But my numbers are generally based on mokgan that have identifiable ink writing on them. And we continue to get a few pieces added to that number pretty much every year as excavations are ongoing. Mokgan were first found at the site in 1992. And because mokkan deposits found on the Korean Peninsula are usually fairly small, the unusually large number found here stands out. And it means that approximately 60% of all known early Korean mokkan come from this one site. And, you know, I think it's something like 80% of Sheilla mokkan come from this one site. So definitely skews things quite a bit if you're trying to do quantitative thinking about Sheilla mokkan. Prior to excavations, which began in the 1990s, as I mentioned, it had long been assumed that this fortress was a fortification going back to the Arakaya polity, which had been centered on the region. But construction techniques and material remains recovered from the site made it pretty obvious that this was actually a Sheilla fortification that was probably built in the mid-6th century and could possibly be this one here. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped over this, but this is just some aerial views of the site. And in terms of strategic location and why Sheilla might have wanted to build a fortress here, this fortress is located on this mountain, which is kind of at the in the southern part of modern Kayaks. But if you want to come into this area from outside, you have to kind of, no matter which road you take, if you're coming from the south, you have to pass by this fortress, right? So, you know, it's a pretty strategic location for that purpose. This is, you know, just an aerial view of what the site looks like now. So, as I mentioned, the site was constructed probably by Sheilla in the mid-6th century. The archaeological excavations have confirmed that, and that could possibly be the same fortress that is actually referenced in the Nihon Shoki, a Japanese historical text from the 8th century, where Sheilla in the year 561 is building a fortress on Mount Pasa in Ara as a way of defending against Japan. And I don't have time to get into the Japan and Sheilla relationship, but generally they were not friendly. And one of Japan's favorite things to do was to raid the Sheilla coast. And certainly they also had allies in the Kaya polities and were looking to try to help restore Kaya polities during the 560s. So it sort of makes sense that, you know, Sheilla was you know, looking at shoring up defenses for that reason, or maybe this is just the Japanese interpretation of things, which is also certainly a possibility. But anyway, this reference in the Nihon Shoki has led to a lot of speculation about the Haman Songsan fortress being the same fortress. But even if it's not the same exact fortress, the mokgan from the site do tell the story of a fortress's construction that is very much tied to Sheilla's larger project of integrating the territory of vanquished Arakaya and other Kaya statelets into its domain. So with one exception, all of the mokgan discovered to date from this site have come from the east gate of the fortress, and specifically from a man-made organic sediment layer that's just under the foundation stones of the wall. In the picture here, you can see what remains of the fortress wall now, which was constructed of earth and stone. And these pictures here, you can see, I think probably most clearly in this picture, what that organic sediment layer looks like. It's this much darker color as opposed to the red clay above it. So this is, you know, the mokgan that are all coming from this sediment layer. This sediment layer was created for two very specific reasons, we think, right? One, to level the ground before the construction of the wall, but also to help with water drainage from inside the fortress. So this layer was deliberately created with a variety of organic material that was loosely packed together, things like reeds, bark, seeds, tree branches, man-made wooden objects being one of those organic material that was thrown into the mix. The particular objects that you find in the layer were probably chosen to be deposited as part of the layer because those building the fortress wanted to dispose of them, get rid of them somehow. But the primary reason for their use here was that there would be enough space between them through which water could flow outside of the fortress, because the east gate of the fortress is at the bottom of a valley. leveling is of course important before you're going to erect a wall there. But in addition, any wall at such a location would effectively become a dam without adequate drainage. And so this organic sediment layer was that sort of 6th century Sheilla fortress engineer's answer to that problem. And in fact, the Kaya National Research Institute of Cultural Heritage, located in Changwon, they've done some experimental archaeology around this question of this organic sediment layer. And they've shown that this sort of sponge-like quality that the layer has, it's capable of absorbing nearly 28 times as much runoff as normal soil. And they've argued on that basis that this is maybe one reason why the eastern wall is still intact and pretty, has held up pretty well over the centuries. So the mokgan have generally been found in the top part of this layer. They were clearly used there again as a type of organic waste. They're really not being treated any differently than other wooden objects that also found their way into the layer. But the fact that they're found here, which is underneath the fortress wall, tells us that they predate the wall, one, right? And they predate the completion of the fortress. And this also has important implications for how then we interpret the inscriptions, and particularly the tag mokkan that make up the majority of the corpus. So, ultimately that those tag mokgan are going to somehow be related to the process of construction. I'm going to get into that now. So let me turn to some of these tags, what they can tell us about the site and how they came to be a part of that organic sediment layer. As I mentioned earlier, we can know from the shape of the objects that these are likely tags, right? That they have that characteristic shape with grooves carved into one end that would have enabled them attachment to some sort of a parcel. About 225 of the 250 mokgan from the Chngsan fortress site can be identified as tags based on their shape alone. The inscriptions all follow a pretty general formula where we have a place name, a personal name, a type of grain, and an amount. Some elements of this formula could be omitted, others might be added, right? When we sometimes get place names that are, both a district name and a village name. The personal name might also be followed by a character like bu or bar. That these, seem to be possibly referencing the parcel itself. And we have 3 examples that possibly include a date as well as part of this formula. But these are all things that we might consider sort of minor divergences from that formula. And for a long time, it was thought that these were labels for tax shipments coming into Chngsan Fortress. But we actually had a document mokgan that was uncovered in 2016 that has kind of changed our understanding of what these are labels for. Essentially, not taxes, but provisions for corvée laborers who were sent to help build the fortress. Which I think helps make sense of why we have so many personal names on these mokgan, because we can imagine that tax shipments would have been compiled or submitted in the village level and not by individuals. I have a few examples here, which I'm not going to dwell on, but kind of just the different variations we get on this formula. Place name, the inclusion of, a qualifier, laborer, or slave prior to a personal name. Just a place name and a personal name is kind of the bare bones, right? Things with a little bit more complication: place name, smaller scale place name, a personal name, a grain, and then an amount. Same thing, just a place name and a personal name. This one is actually quite interesting in that it appears to have some grammar going on here, which is very rare for a tag. But the ending here seems to very clearly be this went, and then this is oftentimes used in Sheilla style idu, which I'll talk about more in a minute, as a sentence ending particle. This also appears to be functioning as a locative here. So this is a pretty interesting example, but generally they all kind of have those essential elements of a place name and a personal name, and then there might be more information provided, and there might not be. And that's, the basic format of the vast majority of this corpus. So the document Mokkan that I was referring to that has kind of changed our understanding of these tags is this one here. And I'm just going to point out here briefly that what it talks about here is something called a ponir tebop. In modern Sino-Korean pronunciation, that this is something that I've translated as a day of substitute law, which admittedly we don't really know exactly what that is, but it probably has something to do with kind of swapping shifts between corvée laborers from the same village. That, you know, your term was 30 days seems to be what's emerging from the context of this inscription. It's known from other sources that a single psalm written with the character for stone or you know, usually pronounced sok in modern Sino-Korean, that was the most common measurement for grain that we see on the Chngsan fortress Mokkan, and that was equivalent to about 30 days provisions for a single person. So the fact that we constantly have one sum occurring on these mokgan suggests that, you know, these labels are indeed labels for provisions for laborers. Returning to the tag corpus briefly, and then before I get back to this, as I mentioned, they all follow that similar format. Some elements are omitted or added. Place names and personal names are transcribed using sinographs primarily as phonograms, and, you know, for their sound only. There may be a few characters that are used as logograms, which would be glosses of Sheilla word, you know, like the you know, the went part of that mokgan that I just pointed out. You know, including both place names and personal names, though, this mokgan corpus features 325 unique examples of Sheilla proper nouns written using around 180 distinct characters. Given our limited knowledge of the Sheilla language, or any peninsular language really at this point in early history, this is a veritable treasure trove of linguistic information. And document mokgan, as well, as I'm going to talk about in more detail in a minute, they also feature transcriptions of the Sheilla language in what we might say is full sentence form, which is meant to be glossed into the vernacular language rather than read as classical Chinese. In terms of what the Mokkan can tell us about the Chngsan fortress site, before I go into more depth on the language, though, is that some scholars have focused very heavily on, you know, phonological reconstruction of Sheilla language made possible by that corpus of proper nouns, but others have tried to figure out where these places actually were. And I think this is really interesting in kind of the context of thinking about Sheilla territory control and efforts at integration that were happening in this period. So some of the locations that could be at least tentatively identified, I've listed here and also placed on this map. I think the really interesting thing that this map shows us is that the places that the laborers are coming from, if again we accept that the tags are labels for provisions of corvée laborers, the places that they're coming from are all easily accessible by water. They're kind of located along tributaries of the Nakdong River here. Not only that, though, for the most part, they appear to have been former Kaya territories. That these are also places that would have come under Sheilla control fairly recently, if we're talking about a mid-6th, late 6th century date. That Sheila's control probably prior to that didn't extend much beyond the coast, and Kaya polities kind of dominated the river network, particularly the Nakdong River. Interestingly, none of these places, though, despite being easily accessible by water, which is important, they are not particularly close to the Haman Chngsan fortress site, right? They're pretty actually removed from it. And so there's also something here maybe where we're forcing laborers to come this far south from their homes as a way of asserting authority over people in those areas, and, you know, eliciting their compliance, you know, is, you know, a way of kind of integrating them into Sheilla's realm. this bringing people in from far away because you can make them and you want to show others you can make them. This is a strategy for exerting control over people in distant outlying areas that are maybe being resistant to a new power that has dominated them. This is something that we also see in, as a comparative example in 7th and 8th century Japan, where we know that border guards for Kyushu on the western frontier were recruited from the far eastern provinces and forced to kind of make this long journey in order to serve their terms there. This was, a way of symbolically integrating the realm as well through creating connections between people from distant parts of it, and it's inducing a sense of belonging and subjecthood. Given that all this was happening in Sheilla in the mid-6th century, it was building up its administrative state to match the challenges posed by substantial territorial acquisitions. It would be difficult to come up with a better way of understanding this map than a deliberate effort to bring people and resources from distant parts of the realm together for a construction project whose mission was the protection of Sheilla territory from outsiders and non-subjects like Paekje or Japan. So as we can see, the Hamon Mokkan are not really from Chngsan Fortress, actually. They're not originally inscribed there. They are from different locations, largely distributed in what was former Kaya territory. But they did all find their way to Hamon, and they were inscribed to be read by somebody who was there. This is simply put, these newly acquired territories that were once part of the Kayak Confederacy are now following the new rules that were instituted by Sheilla and dispatching corvée laborers along with their provisions. And having a label for those provisions, the mokgan, are inscribing that at a local district office as part of that compliance with those new rules. When we look at the corpus of mokgan from the Chngsan Fortress site, we are looking not just at writing and written culture as used in Hamon, then we are looking at it as a product of how writing was being used in the larger region to integrate it into Sheilla's domain. In other words, writing was an important tool for Sheilla in bringing together of near and far as it connected Sheilla subjects across space and time. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the several document mokgan recovered from the Chngsan Fortress, two of which feature pieces of correspondence directed to officials at the fortress from local village heads, communications that could be conducted directly through the use of the new technology of writing. The local official, in inscribing his message on a mokgan to be delivered to central officials who are located at the Chngsan Fortress, acknowledged the authority of the center and the mutual subjecthood of himself and the recipient. So this is that document mokgan again here. I briefly addressed the content here a minute ago, so I'm just going to talk now briefly about the way that it is written. Specifically, it is one of two document mokgan from the site, which feature irrefutable evidence of what we could call proto-Idu style writing. And Idu, in the sense that I'm using it today, is basically a catch-all term for full sentence length transcription of the vernacular Korean languages using sinographs. So here we have, I think I actually have that definition down here. We have Jung being used as a locative particle. We have this sentence final G, which I referenced already. We have what appears to be a continuative myo here. At least we know this character to be read myo in a kugel context. We also have the text being framed by four separate instances of this character pek, which is a humilific verb meaning to report in this context. So we have one actually on each side here, pek, 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 pek. This sort of framing is also seen in early epigraphic texts from Sheilla and is suggestive of a written culture that retained elements of the oral. We have the speaker constantly declaring that they are reporting, and this seems to be an attempt to kind of enact and perform that, what would normally have been an oral report through the inscription, and emphasizing that humilific stance that the speaker is taking. The repetition of the verb is unnecessary and superfluous in a standard classical Chinese. The majority of the text here is also clearly in vernacular word order, that is subject, object, verb, instead of the standard Chinese subject, verb, object. And there appears to be actually intentional use of spacing to indicate semantic breaks. to the extent that, that you can see this very clearly here in the image, these very big spaces left open. And this seems to have been done, again, to indicate semantic breaks, but the scribe has been doing it so enthusiastically and so liberally, but by the time he gets to the fourth side here, he's run out of space, and you can see the text is much more crammed in there. So it's sort of an interesting thing to note as well. We have one more document, Mokkan, recovered from the Chngsan fortress that shares many of these same features, although it is proved less easily deciphered because of the state of the inscription. But here again, we have a village head submitting a report, presumably to a superior located at Chngsan fortress. And the local official is inscribing his compliance with the rules of the center there. We have, again, multiple uses of pek, but actually only two in this case, which is sort of more typical, that we kind of start the report with this pek G construction, and then here we end again with pek. But interestingly, this here appears to be which is of course a direct object particle. We have what could be the Kugyeol honorific kyun here, but in the context it probably is not an honorific, but might just be a perfective in the attributive form. We also have G being used as an attributive here, and this character che being used as a continuative or possibly perfective auxiliary. So as I mentioned, these two Mokkan inscriptions have much in common with certain early Sheilla epigraphic sources. For the purposes of time, I'm just going to very quickly note this very famous example, which like that first Mokkan that I showed that has tons of pek, 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 pek. This one has lots of so, vow. And, that aspect of kind of that repetitive, using that verb over and over again, definitely has echoes in this source, which is dated usually to 552. So we're talking about approximately the same time period here. So when Sheilla, think maybe again, because I want to leave enough time for questions here. I'll just note that we do also have an example of this from the capital site at the site in Gyeongju, the Wosong Moat site, where we actually don't have the repetition of pek, but we do have this kind of introducing the content of the report in the same way, with this being used as a sentence final. We have what looks like an idu construction here, and a idu final, basically saying, it was reported or was carried out. So we have that same kind of thing happening in capital inscriptions at this point, but possibly in the Chngsan fortress, the provincial context, kind of more of a focus on the ease of the recipient being able to gloss and understand the message, and that we kind of have already these the interpolation of these elements of the vernacular language that are kind of meant to help facilitate more effective communication between people that maybe are somewhat limited in their literacy in classical Chinese, and so the vernacular becomes a useful intermediary there. So I think I want to maybe just end here by noting that each site that I've talked about has its own particularities, but when we compare them to Chngsan Fortress, I would say the major difference, the major thing that stands out is, again, that organic sediment layer. I think there can be no doubt that the Corvée labor system, into which we get such great insight through the Chngsan Fortress Mokkan, was probably operational at the other sites as well, right? It would be sort of weird if it wasn't. Particularly Isong Fortress and Kayang Fortress, which we know were constructed in the mid-6th century as well, right? And they're both being built to overlook and protect Sheila's northern frontier, just as Chngsan Fortress was being built to protect this, vanquished Arakaya polity. So, But because in those sites, we don't have that same organic sediment layer, and so we don't have mokkan deposited as part of the organic waste used to construct that layer, we don't have the same number of mokkan. I think it kind of just comes down to that. It would seem to be the case generally in Korea that a large percentage of the wooden waste was probably incinerated on a normal basis. And so this is actually kind of an anomaly where they needed material for this layer. And so the mokkan kind of incidentally ended up as part of that and survived for that reason. They were not accidentally deposited. They were deliberately used as material for that layer. And that's why we have so many of them, because of the nature of their deposition, that they were deliberately included instead of being disposed of by other methods. I think we can say that to an extent they are actually representative of what written culture would have looked like at a Sheilla frontier fortress in this period. This is a unique case in preservation, but I don't think it's necessarily a unique corpus of writing for its time. In fact, if it were, one must wonder why it actually would have been included as part of the sediment layer. That mokkan were reused in this way precisely because they were ordinary. I think it allows us to read them as a representative cross-section for the use of writing in mid-6th century provincial Sheilla, and one that we are very fortunate to have. And I hope that, all of this kind of helps, again, show effectively that writing in mid-6th century Sheilla was a tool of the state for integrating its territory, something that was very explicitly and quickly put to use in response to the real need in the aftermath of successful territorial acquisitions in the course of the 6th century. So I'm going to stop there. I apologize for the long presentation, but I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. That was absolutely fascinating. I have a ton of questions, and I'm sure everyone else does too. Just as a reminder, if you could write your questions down in the Q&A box, and I will go through those and ask them as they come in. But if I could just maybe start with a question of my own, just to get things started, a general question. And I hope this doesn't force you to speculate unnecessarily too much, but I'm curious about the general level of literacy in Sheilla at this time. So who was writing, who was reading, and yeah, what was the general status of literacy in Sheilla? What percentage of the population was writing?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And yeah, one that I kind of glossed over a little bit. But I mean, yes, anything I say is going to be very speculative. But the general impression that I have from looking at this body of material, from the examples that I was just showing you that have these kind of elements of the vernacular language in them, is that, we still have people who are fairly limited in their ability to write in a standard classical Chinese, if that's what we're looking for, right? And so they start, you see very early on, right? And this is one of the earliest corpuses of mokkan that we have. You see very early on the vernacular elements of the vernacular language making their way in here, because I think it's kind of a shorthand. It's something that I've in the past sometimes called a written Creole, because it sort of helps bridge the gap between people who have kind of limited ability in this literary language, but are still wanting to make use of this technology of writing. So they, come up with these workarounds, these shortcuts. And so, that's I think where that particular style of writing and those particular document mokkan that I was just talking about are coming from. In terms of kind of overall literacy, yeah, that's sort of difficult to say. I see kind of similar patterns actually, in Sheilla and Japan, actually, which I also work on that, because we have sort of enough information to kind of make these connections, that it seems that, okay, so we have this move towards state centralization that begins the first quarter of the 6th century, but really picks up in the mid-6th century. And you need people, in order to make that happen, you need people who are literate. You need those human resources, right? So where do they come from? And in the case of Japan, right, and looking at this kind of similar period in Japanese history, which is more kind of the mid to late 7th century, about a century later, it's actually immigrants from the peninsula who kind of drive that forward, right? Because we've just had Paekje destroyed. You've had an influx of immigrants into Japan. They teach writing to people in Japan, and you have about a generation where it's kind of this transitional generation where you primarily have people who are literate, who are of immigrant background, teaching people who are, kind of a more originally Japanese background. And then you have that kind of transition happening over the course of a generation. In the case of Sheilla, there are theories out there that happened very similarly, or basically you have people from Koryo kind of filling that role, and that there was an influx of people from Koguryo in the last part of the 5th century, and they and their descendants kind of became the driving force for literacy education and the spread of literacy. But a lot of this is kind of based on pretty scanty evidence, but I think it's a very interesting theory, because if you just think about it in practical terms, right, where do you get those human resources from? How do you teach people how to read and write fast enough to be able to do what you need to do? And the simplest answer to that is just get people that already know how to do it from elsewhere and have them teach your people, right? So that's kind of my view on this process and how it must have happened. But again, it's very, very speculative. But hopefully that answers your question.
It absolutely does, and thank you for wildly speculating. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm just so struck by how late it seems for Silla. But yeah, you make this quite convincing case that it's the 6th century where all this starts to happen. It's
yeah,
great.
Sheilla is famously the most belated of the 3 kingdoms. Yeah, it's there's all sorts of talk about maybe it was resistant to adopting some of these Chinese models until it really needed to, and things like that. We don't actually know why really, but yes, it does seem that they just didn't have much of an interest in it until they started having more land that they had to administer. So
well, I don't want to monopolize this Q&A too much, so let me go to the Q&A box here. We actually have a question from Ross King, who is our prior Premodern lecture series speaker. So go to the YouTube page and check out his talk. But he has a question about, I don't know, Marjorie, if you can see this too, but he has a question about the citation from the Liang Shu and what it might suggest. He's asking what the second sentence means. Is it something that suggests not? Let me just read it. I forget how you translated it on your slide, but surely this is a juxtaposition of written language and spoken language, in which case what this second sentence means is, as for spoken language, they rely on Paekje in order to communicate with China or the Liang. We know that Sheilla relied on Paekje interpreters with their embassies and representative tagged along with Paekje delegations to the Liang.
That's certainly true. So I'm not sure. I actually don't remember if that's my translation or someone else's translation, but looking at this here, I can see that this interpretation certainly would make more sense. This is something that I'm going to have to sit down and look at in more detail, but it certainly would change a few things in terms of my interpretation, right? That they are relying on Paekje in order to communicate with China because they don't use letters. Okay, that's actually really interesting. Thank you, Professor King. I will dig into that a little bit more, and I apologize if that was a mistranslation there.
We have another question from Caroline Bland. Although erosion makes most of the text on Mokkan illegible, is there any evidence available to determine the method of transcription used? So how are these being written upon, these strips?
I mean, with brush and ink, it's similar to, how we might think of, writing on paper. We know that kind of the the tools you need to write or transcribe something and inscribe something on a mokkan are, an inkstone, a brush, and a small carving knife, right? So that you can erase, right? That's one of the great things about mokkan in terms of, utility as opposed to paper, is that you can scrape off the surface and reuse it. So, there's when you find those things, as part of the material assemblage, that also implies that people are transcribing mokkan at the site. So that's also something that's really interesting. Like I mentioned with the Isong Fortress site, where we have a bunch of inkstones being found there, which is kind of, very rare to have that many inkstones there, right? So this also implies something about the written culture of that site being very, very unique. Whereas a place like Haman, where mostly the inscriptions are coming in from the outside and then being read at the fortress, right? So there's a very different dynamic there in terms of production and consumption. But yeah, basically, to answer there's been a lot of studies, Japanese scholars who work on mokkan and kind of how you would need to hold the mokkan, hold it in your hand to transcribe it, basically, things to that effect. There's definitely studies out there if that's what you're interested in terms of method of transcription. But in terms of materials used, yeah, it's the brush and ink, just like you would use to transcribe on, to write on paper in this period.
That's really interesting. And actually we actually have evidence of ink brushes going back much farther than this in the
yes,
peninsula. So
the Tauri tomb, right? Yeah.
So it's really interesting again how we have this very late Sheilla writing, but this very early evidence perhaps of some kind of writing before that.
Right. Could also just be lacquerware brushes or prestige.
That's very true.
Right. Yes, but yeah.
We have another question from James Lewis, and if I can just remind everyone, if you do have a question, if you could put it in the Q&A box and not the chat box, so that I can go through these and make sure your question gets answered. But James Lewis asks, can you briefly compare and contrast Sheilla Mokkan with Yamato Mokkan?
I mean, can I? No, because it's just, it depends on what you mean by Yamato Mokkan, I guess. If we're talking about all of Japanese Mokkan are like 400,000, and Sheilla Mokkan are, 300, right? So it's a very different number, and it doesn't lend itself well to comparison. In terms of, I am kind of actually really interested in this phenomenon of provincial mokkan, again, kind of in a similar period in Japanese history in the late 7th century, how writing is being used at provincial sites. And that is something that does kind of lend itself to more to comparison, because it's sort of more, specific. But basically, that you do kind of have some of these very similar phenomena in late 7th century Japan in provincial sites. For instance, this kind of what I was talking about, this written Creole, where you have this kind of text that has these vernacular elements in it, that's kind of seems to be this like stopgap bridge between kind of literacy and orality, that's kind of helping when we're in this context where people aren't kind of fully literate, fully immersed in the classical Chinese language to the extent that you might want them to be. So you definitely have that kind of phenomena as well. You have sites being located in key strategic locations, and a lot of the writing that the inscriptions that you find there being related to administering that piece of land and kind of creating a relationship with the center. That is, when mokkan pop up in provincial sites in the late 7th century, and there's not a whole lot of them, there's a lot more for the 8th century, but when they do pop up, they are inevitably at sites that are part of this process of integrating, center and province and kind of asserting central authority in the provinces. So in those terms, there's definitely a lot of parallels. And I didn't have time to include it in my presentation today, but there's actually one mokgan in particular that I'm very fond of from Omi province from the late 7th century. And the style of inscription is just so similar to those document mokgan that I was talking about from the Chngsan fortress site that I think you could show that to a person from Sheilla and they could read it. Even down to the characters that are being used for vernacular inflections, like that sentence final particle, that character G, you see that there as well. You have a different verb. It's not, because it's kind of more of a communication between equals. It's not the peck. It's not the form of the humilific. You have a ton or style to tell. But the structure is very similar, and the way in which these vernacular glosses are you can do this process of vernacular glossing on these type of texts. Oftentimes it's not confined to one language or the other, right? There's sort of a mutual intelligibility there, but again, a lot of that is probably coming from the Japanese in that period having peninsular teachers as well. So hopefully that is answers your question. But this is that, comparing and contrasting Sheilla mokgan with Yamato mokgan, that's kind of my whole research schema. So I could go on and on about that, couldn't I?
Yes, so be sure to buy Dr. Burge's book when it comes out for answer to these questions and more. We also have a question from Jaeyang Ha. Does the linguistic evidence demonstrated in Baekje and Sheilla suggest a difference in languages in both countries? I think you touched on this a little bit, and it goes back to that inscription that Ross was referring to. But what do you say about this?
Well, the general consensus is that we're more akin to kind of dialogues or dialects than different languages, right? That there was a mutual intelligibility there, and that's what the Liangshi suggests as well. As far as I know, there's not anybody who's really disputing that. Of course, there's, different discussions about kind of there being multiple languages in the Baekje context with, the nobility speaking maybe a Koguryo derived language and the people that they're ruling over speaking a Han language more similar to the Sheilla language. That if that was the case, it probably, is no longer the case when you're getting further into, the 6th century and into the 7th century. So, as far as I understand it linguistically, they're fairly similar, but more akin to dialects. And there's actually one mokgan from Muruksa in Iksan, which has been interpreted as kind of having transcriptions of vernacular numerals. And if that is in fact the case, and it does technically date from after Sheilla conquest of Baekje, but not too much later, probably something like the 680s. So if that is the case, that is, that those are transcriptions of vernacular numerals, then those numerals definitely seem to be fairly similar to Sheilla numerals. So it is more kind of support for the idea that the languages were, for the most part, mutually intelligible. But I'm not a linguist. I always need to say that because I'm kind of, this is not necessarily my field of expertise, but that's my understanding.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Miriam Teresi, and I apologize if I'm getting names wrong here. But is there anything that suggests that mokkan were not the only medium used for communication? Like, was paper used for short distances because of travel conditions, that the mokkan were communicated with non-local folks?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So this is something I kind of I cut out because I was going on too long there. But yes, I think part of the reason we don't have more mokgan coming from the Sheilla capital is probably because they were mostly using paper in the capital, and part of the reason you get mokgan more in the provinces is because of this reason that paper doesn't travel as well. There's if you want to get a message across distances and you're concerned about the messenger carrying that and it making it, mokgan is going to be more durable, right? So in terms of, mokgan are certainly not the only thing that's being used for communication, right? Because there is paper at this point, right? And we even know from the Chngsan fortress site, we find the kind of central index rods for scrolls at that site. So that, that there was probably paper at that site as well. But, that there was kind of this material division of labor, that mokgan were used for certain types of functions, and because they did have this durability, they did have this, you can erase it and reuse it, that sort of functionality, that it kind of lends itself to certain kinds of inscriptions. Again, if you think about what tag mokgan are and why we have so many of those, right, that's not something where you're going to want to stick a piece of paper on there because it's not going to endure. Yeah, so this is, you've kind of answered your own question here pretty much, I would say. But that, yes, the mokgan kind of seem to be used for these more long distance, durable purposes, and paper probably was used in more short distances, and particularly in the capital was probably more important than mokgan as a writing material.
We have another question in the Q&A from the great Jonathan Best, another early Koreanist. He has a question about the Haman Songsan fortress and when it was built and what its purpose was. So he says, according to both the Samguk Sagi and the Nihon Shoki, Sheilla conquered Taegaya in 562.
Yep.
Most of the corvée laborers who worked at the fortress came from the area of Taegaya. So it seems improbable that in 561 they would have been subject to Sheila's control to work. We would like to suggest that workers from so far away were used there in part for security reasons. They would have had no allegiance to the locale. Yeah, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I agree, right, that is also another reason why they would have been bringing people in from the outside, that they, are they're not going to have any connections to the local people. And so, the amount of distance that's placed in between is also kind of, I think, appropriate to that sort of interpretation too, right? It's not like so very far, right? And it's still accessible by river, but it's far enough that they're not necessarily going to have those connections. So I didn't mean to suggest that it is certainly that same fortress, although for the most part, a lot of Korean scholars have indeed kind of taken this as, okay, this is Songsan Fortress 561, that's the date. Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that that's definitely the case. If they started construction on the fortress in 561 and then they, conquer Taegaya in 562, maybe these laborers are coming down kind of in the aftermath of that conquest. I mean, it's all speculative at this point. But, what I meant by kind of bringing up that example is more to kind of bring it into this discussion of Sheilla kind of building on places that, building a fortress like Songsan Fortress at that former Arakaya capital, building fortresses in the Han River Valley, that this is all coming out of that same impulse to kind of get this territory under control, and bringing in those corvée laborers and having them bring those kind of inscribed parcels with their name and a certain amount of provisions, right? This is all kind of part of that general scheme of kind of bringing the realm together and creating this, new Sheilla and from the mid 6th century forward, that is kind of, based on these Chinese bureaucratic models. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly problems, and I apologize if I, seemed like I was, adhering to this theory, because I agree, there are a lot of problems with saying that is Songsan Fortress that we have in the Kimhei annals, in the Samsagi, or sorry, in the Nihon Shoki. I think it's very hard to necessarily to prove one way or the other that Mount Pasa and Songsan Fortress are the same, one and the same, right? That's sort of not that important, I think, in the end, right? I think what is important is that this fortress does kind of date to this general period after the conquest of all these different Kaya polities, and seems to have been a part of Sheilla integrating those new territories into its domain. But yes, thank you very much for pointing that out, Professor Best. I appreciate that. And my apologies again if it sounded like I was advocating for that interpretation.
Let's see. I think we're let's see, we have a couple, I think we have time for one more question, and I think I missed a couple of questions here. We have, again, I apologize for mispronouncing names, Furdas Intaj and Devin Kirkpatrick asking about one, the preservation of Mokkan, why Haman Songsan has so many compared to the others. I think you answered that towards the end of your talk, but if we could combine that and ask, Devin Kirkpatrick is asking, what was the notch used in the tags? I think you talked about that too, but can we talk a bit more about, with these two questions, the method of handling, transportation, and using these, and what is the life cycle of a mokkan? How does it end up where it does? And yeah, walk us through the life of a mokkan if you could.
Well, I'm not sure that I can really do that too, but I can definitely speculate. So that's yes, and are actually within this corpus of tags. I didn't have time to get into this either. There are different individuals coming from the same place, right? If you think about that place name plus personal name construction, there are different individuals coming from the same place, or sometimes you have kind of the same district plus those smaller scale place names, the villages, right? So when you see like those mokkan that are coming from the same district but maybe from different villages or for different personal names, sometimes those look like they're inscribed in the same hand, right? And I mean, it's hard to tell necessarily 100%, but this is definitely you have that same district name appearing on all these mokkan that look like they're probably written by the same person. So there seems to then maybe be in terms of the life cycle of a mokkan, a process by which these corvée laborers may be reported to the district office right before they end up going down to the fortress, and they bring their provisions with them. And I'm sort of imagining this, so forgive me, but at the district office, a literate official is tasked with writing down where that person is coming from, what their name is, and then how much grain they're bringing with them. And then they then attach that to the parcel of provisions that the person has with them, and that person then carries that to the Chngsan fortress site with them. At which point, right, there's, once you've got the provisions there, once the laborer has consumed them, right, over the course of their labor term, then presumably the mokkan is no longer needed, right, no longer useful, and ends up being disposed of in some way. And as I said, a lot of them end up in this organic sediment layer. But my general impression, kind of again based on what I know of the Japanese context and how we get so many mokkan coming from there, and then Korea, people talk about acidic soil in Korea, but it just doesn't really explain much. I think to me, it's probably that, and we actually have evidence of this even from some of the Chngsan fortress mokkan, that they have charring on them, that they've clearly been burned halfway. So it seems like generally kind of the method of disposal was burning. And in the case of Chngsan fortress, it's kind of a unique situation where they needed this bulky organic material, and so they ended up throwing some mokkan in with them, but into that layer. But in general, I think they would have disposed of them by burning. And so most of the mokkan we get from Sheilla, from Paekje, seem to have been mostly kind of accidental deposits, not things that, in Japan you get them, collecting a bunch of them and burying them to get rid of them, right? So it's a very sort of different situation, and I think that's kind of really the only way of explaining why there's such a vast difference in numbers between those different situations. But yes, if that is kind of the life cycle of a mokkan from Chngsan fortress as far as I can imagine it, but I think certainly other people might be able to kind of construct it differently. But I think that's kind of the basic outline of how it must have happened based on the evidence that we have of the inscriptions at least kind of taking place at a single location per district, it seems. So.
Wonderful. Well, I think we are just about out of time. So let me just end by saying again, thank you to everyone for coming and asking questions. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Burge for giving your time and your expertise to talk about this wonderful, fascinating, and I think cutting edge research topic in
Thank
early
you. I
Korean
appreciate
studies. So
that.
yeah, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate it.